Yes guys, hope you're all good and welcome back to the YouTube channel. So it's been quite a while since I did my last video and I've actually completed my prep now, so that show day vlog will be coming out very soon just to complete the prep series. But what I want to do in today's video is basically go through how I'm going to transition from my prep into a gaining phase now, and how you might want to transition as well from a dieting phase into a gaining phase. This transition is really important because it allows you to set yourself up for a really long-term gaining phase, and if you get it wrong and end up binging, putting on unnecessary fat, you're not going to put yourself in a good position to start that gaining phase and therefore make a lot of progress in the long term. Also, we really want to use this phase to basically maximize performance. At the end of the diet, your performance in the gym is probably not going to be quite as good as it would be in a surplus, and therefore we really need to focus on creating leverages for performance basically, and therefore getting that in a good spot so we can optimize building muscle in the surplus. The best place to start is probably the end point of your diet, so analyzing what kind of body composition you're at, because that's going to make a big difference as to where you're going to go from there. If you're in stage condition and you're very, very lean, you need to make sure you're getting on some fat very quickly basically. You can't be basically staying at maintenance for any amount of time because you're in a position where hormonally you're going to be compromised, training performance is going to be in a really bad spot as well. And then also recovery variables like sleep might not be in a good spot either. So if you are in stage condition or sub 10% body fat, you probably want to just put on a few pounds of fat first, make sure you're recovered from the diet before going into a set gaining phase where you're looking to build some muscle. So in this case, what we're going to look to try and do is basically minimize stress in the body. So we've got three forms of stress mainly: from training, from the diet being in a deficit as a stressor on the body, and then also life stressors as well. If we can try and minimize all three of those, it's going to put us in a much better position to go into the gaining phase and therefore achieve what we want to achieve effectively in terms of building muscle. So the main way we're actually going to reduce stress is firstly by pulling yourself out of the deficit, so putting yourself into a surplus, and then also by bringing down expenditure to a baseline. So you're probably pushing expenditure quite hard at the end of the diet, and therefore you bring that down to make sure that you're not battering your body on a daily basis. That's probably a good point to start your gaining phase. Training's a bit more simple because you probably have been doing deloads or devolumes throughout your dieting phase, and therefore you probably shouldn't be quite as stressed from a training perspective, especially towards the end of a dieting phase when you're not progressing quite as much. So that's what I'd do if I was coming out of a competition prep or being very, very lean. So for example, with my prep now, in the first week after prep, I made sure to put on like 3 to 4 pounds of body fat just to get my body back in a better position to go into the gym and perform well. Also from a hormone perspective, I wanted to get my testosterone back up to a good spot pretty much straight away, as I had been dieting for 28 weeks and therefore that was slightly affected towards the end. So I pretty much tracked my calories the week after my prep. I basically had between 3,500 and 4,000 calories for that whole week. So I was tracking, having a bit of balance, but also making sure I had enough food to put some fat on as well. And therefore I gained around 5 pounds that week, and that put me in a much better spot hormonally, but also just feeling a lot better in general in terms of energy and training performance in the gym. On the other hand, if you haven't done a competition prep and you're not stage lean, say you just dieted down for a holiday or a photo shoot, potentially even just a mini cut, in my opinion, then you have an opportunity to stay in a deficit for slightly longer, a reversing phase basically, where you're slowly tapering your food up, slowly tapering your expenditure down to try and build your food up to a really, really high baseline while you're still in a deficit by reversing metabolic adaptation which have occurred during the diet basically, and therefore have a higher total daily energy expenditure. That basically allows you to push food high while staying in a deficit, and therefore you're setting yourself up for a gaining phase where you're slightly leaner than you were previously, but also you've got food in a much better spot to then push food even higher when you're going into the surplus. So I do think there is an opportunity there if you are not that lean to go into a reversing phase and stay in that deficit, and also leverage the performance by that increase in food. So towards the end of the diet, when you haven't got that much food coming in and therefore energy availability isn't in the best spot, what we can then look to do in a reversing phase is try and leverage some performance by increasing that energy availability by having higher carbs, and therefore we can create progression while still remaining in the deficit, and therefore when you go into the gaining phase, you're going to be even leaner, performance is going to be in an even better spot, and therefore you've got a really long runway for progression going forward in that gaining phase to try and maximize muscle growth over that time. So the next section I want to go on to is nutrition, because this is going to be a very important variable when it comes to managing your nutrition over this transition to make sure that you're not binging or not going above your calories, and making sure you're basically performing the transition very effectively. So when you are coming towards the end of a diet, basically your hunger hormones are going to be a bit out of whack. During that diet that you've just done, your body's going to slowly adapt to that deficit by increasing ghrelin levels and decreasing leptin levels to basically make you more hungry and therefore bring you back to maintenance calories. After the diet, this still applies. So if you're below your body fat set point, these hunger hormones are still going to be out of whack, and therefore you need to really control your appetite in this reversing phase to make sure you are setting yourself up well for the gaining phase. I really do like to actually implement hunger management techniques in this phase to try and manage appetite to a greater extent and therefore maximize adherence. So some of the things I like to do are increasing caffeine intake in the morning, increasing protein intake throughout the whole diet, increasing fibre intake and food volume. Those 4 things, and also water intake, can really help you fill yourself up and therefore allow you to stick to the amount of calories you're supposed to be having on a daily basis. After a dieting phase as well, food focus and cravings are going to be through the roof basically. You've had this time where you've been pretty restrictive, and therefore after the diet, your body's going to want to go and have all these foods that you're craving. But something I do like to do in that first couple of weeks after the diet is switch to an if it fits your macros approach to try and allow some of these cravings to be satisfied. So you're still tracking your calories, you're still trying to hit your macros, but you can fit in these foods which you might be craving throughout the diet, and therefore just basically satisfy those cravings. So you can go forward and just go back to your usual nutrition. I think this can teach you a really useful skill as well. Learning how to stay balanced while also staying on track is a very important skill to learn for the future, to make sure that you can basically manage your energy balance while also enjoying foods that you do like. In some scenarios, depending on the personality of the individual, you're going to want to stick to a meal plan in this phase. For example, if someone eats what they're craving and then just wants to have more of that, they probably want to stay on the meal plan just for a little bit longer to make sure they can be adherent in that phase, rather than switching to the if it fits your macros approach straight away. In terms of the changes to nutrition which you want to make coming out of the diet, it's going to be highly dependent on basically what the rate of loss was before you ended that diet. So for example, if you're losing weight at around 1 pound per week, that shows that you were in around a 500 calorie deficit per day. And if you want to go into a surplus, you're going to have to add more calories than that to get into a surplus. So kind of work out what deficit you were in before, and then add enough food in depending on what phase you're going into, whether it be a reversing phase, add a little bit less than maintenance. And if you're going into a gaining phase, add a bit more than maintenance. And that should put your food at a spot where you can basically call it a baseline and then adjust from there depending on what your weight does over the next couple of weeks. In terms of the macros that I would add, I'd make sure that fats are at a baseline. Sometimes in dieting phases, your fats are going to have to get quite low, and therefore bringing them back up to a baseline where you're getting a healthy amount of fats in per day is probably a good idea when you go into that gaining phase. So usually I'd say around 0.6 grams per kilogram would be around the minimum amount of fats you want to have per day. Protein should be at a good level already from the dieting phase, so just keeping that at around 0.4 grams per kilogram per meal is probably about right. And then you can pretty much make up the rest of the calories from carbs to try and maximize performance as much as possible. So next up, we'll move on to training, and this is probably the variable which changes the least when going from phase to phase. So obviously in a dieting phase, you're going to not progress quite as much, but the movement you're doing, the split you're on probably stays pretty similar compared to when you're in a surplus. However, I do quite like to use this transitional phase to basically have a bit of a mental reset, create a bit more enjoyment from training, a bit more motivation by starting a new split or starting a new training program. And therefore we're really, really excited to go back into the gym, start this new program, and then we'll try and stick to that plan for pretty much the whole gaining phase. The split and movement should change as little as possible after that. But I do find that mental reset works quite well when transitioning into a gaining phase. The good thing about being really lean, you can actually see what your weak points are. When you're very lean, because you haven't got much fat on you, you can pretty much see exactly where you're less developed and more developed in terms of muscularity. So take a look at your physique, see if there's any glaring weak points, glaring strong points, and then maybe use that within your new training split to try and bring up those weak points to create a really balanced physique as well. Usually what I do as well in this first week of the transitional phase is to basically reset numbers, reset movement patterns to make sure the form is really strict, the tempo is really strict, and therefore you're creating a really long runway for progression with these movements because you know form is nailed, and therefore you're going to get as much stimulus from every single rep that you're doing. Naturally, as you progress, your execution and tempo are going to get slightly worse over time, and therefore starting with these variables nailed within your training gives you that long runway to progress these lifts over time. Once you've set baseline numbers, what I'd do is go through your numbers for each exercise, and pretty much for your compound lifts, set some big targets for the future, set some big strength goals that you're striving for. You probably want to make these goals a little bit unrealistic as well, and then just chase them down relentlessly throughout your whole gaining phase. And if you can do that and you can get to the strength levels which seemed unrealistic, you're going to build a lot of muscle tissue as long as you're keeping the execution pretty much the same. So finally, I'll go on to expenditure. So at the end of your diet, you're probably going to have very high levels of expenditure, whether that be steps or cardio. The best thing to do when transitioning into a gaining phase is slowly taper these down rather than pull them out completely. If you pull them out completely, that's going to have quite a big impact on total daily energy expenditure, and therefore the surplus that you're creating is probably going to be a little bit bigger than you think, even though you're not actually adding that much food. So make sure you're tapering it down slowly and at least leave some baseline amount of cardio in your gaining phase. This is a mistake that I and a lot of people have done in the past, is not doing any cardio in the gaining phase. If anything, cardio is going to benefit you from a recovery standpoint, and therefore it's going to lead to more muscle growth. But not only that, making sure you're staying cardiovascularly fit while pushing up body weight is very important for longevity as well. So yeah, that's the video done, guys. Hopefully you learned something from this video about how to transition from a dieting phase to a gaining phase. A couple of things I've got to plug now because we have started a new podcast on the coaching channel. I'll plug that in the description below. So check out that channel, subscribe to it, check out the new podcast as well. We're pretty much going to be doing bi-weekly in-person podcasts, weekly educational podcasts, all on that channel. So rather than the podcast being on my channel now, we'll do it on there with a new name and a couple more hosts. Also, if you are interested, I'm taking on more online clients this month. So drop me a DM on Instagram and I'll get back to you with a video going through the service and how I can help you get to your goals. I'm sure would work really well together. So that's the video done, guys, and I will catch you in a bit.